Chapter 8. Daniel sat back down at his desk and picked up the papers containing the other cases on his workload. He looked at the words on the paper, but could not keep his thoughts from straying back to the girl. She was no longer his concern, but she was still a mystery. He hated to leave a mystery unsolved. Who was she? What was the significance of the green eyes? He wished he had learned her name so he could contact her parents and let them know her whereabouts. Perhaps they could figure out a way to get her out. On the other hand, perhaps it was better he didn't. Daniel now suspected there could be a very good reason for their absence. Seeking them out or contacting them might make their situation worse. Daniel sighed and set down the papers. He was getting nowhere with his work. Noting the hour, Daniel decided it was time for lunch. Perhaps he would be better able to do his job after a formal break. He signed himself out for lunch, opened his desk drawer, removed his box lunch, and left the office. A few minutes later, Daniel entered the staff room reserved for nuns. It was a very tiny place, scarcely larger than his office. A single battered table stood in the middle, surrounded by a couple of rickety old chairs. The walls were covered with posters of people working in the Ministry of Magic: Anton Dolev, Rudolphus Lestrange, Augustus Rockwood, Rabastan Lestrange, Amicus Caro, Electo Caro, Barty Crouch, Death Eaters, all of them, and in absolute control. They stared out at him, looking proud, arrogant, and victorious. Daniel sat down in one of the chairs and set his lunch on the table. He poured himself a cup of tea, took a bite of his meat pie, and closed his eyes while he slowly chewed. Actually, the nuns working in security had gotten together and used their magic to create a rather pleasant staff room with picture windows and a rippling stream. But the Undersecretary to the Department of Security, Dolores Umbridge, paid a visit to the nuns' staff room one day. She declared that such decorations were not in keeping with nun abilities and status, so it was all dismantled. The Undersecretary sent them posters to be placed up in the nuns' staff room instead. She called them more suitable wall coverings. The posters were a depressing lot, and most of the nuns took their lunch elsewhere rather than look at them. Daniel didn't mind, though. The posters were depressing, true, but silent. He found that if he closed his eyes while he ate, he could imagine sitting at his home eating with his wife and family. When he opened his eyes, he could look directly into the poster faces, eye to eye, as equals. Daniel could still remember the days when the Slytherins walked as equals among the rest of the students. Things had been different then. It hadn't been the greatest, but it was much better than what came later. After Dumbledore died and none stood in his way, the Dark Lord took full power. It was then the students were resorted into two houses. Shortly afterwards, his father pulled Daniel aside for a talk at Christmas break. "You're still a Ravenclaw," his father told him, "no matter what the hat says. Ravenclaws are smart. You're going to have to use your brains now more than ever. Keep out of the affairs of Slytherins, for they seek to further only themselves and would destroy all who get in their way. Bend with the wind," he advised. "Use your intelligence to stay alive and to keep others alive. For if you don't, the Dark Lord's madness will consume us all." So Daniel accepted the new Slytherin rules in silence and bowed when commanded. He had survived, while many of his classmates were not so fortunate. Those who spoke out against the Dark Lord or of the injustices and unfairness of his new ways were repeatedly tormented and tortured. The louder, more persistent ones, mostly those who once called themselves Gryffindors, were eventually silenced. Some of these people ended up in Azkaban prison. Some died a violent death, and their bodies, like Cedric's, had been left for public discovery, a grim message of what would happen to those still daring to oppose the Dark Lord. Others just vanished. No one doubted their final fate. Daniel opened his eyes and looked at the posters. He took another bite. They were face to face now, he and the Slytherins, like equals. That's how the girl behaved. She hadn't known how to keep her eyes averted. The girl tried after Daniel explained it, but when stressed, she reverted to her wide-eyed stare. 2 years earlier, Layla had wept bitterly over Christmas break when describing her first months at Hogwarts. She told Daniel how the Slytherins systematically tortured, tormented, and repeatedly tested each non-student, insisting the students display proper respect under every circumstance. Daniel almost felt relief when Layla also related that Headmaster Snape had not relaxed his iron control over the school. Daniel realized that while Headmaster Snape was in charge, the Slytherin harassment Layla experienced might be painful and or demeaning, but it wouldn't cause her lasting physical damage. When the Dark Lord took power, he required a population of wizards, if not in agreement, at least compliant to his will. Severus Snape had done his part as Hogwarts headmaster. Students leaving Hogwarts knew their place and were able to take part in the Dark Lord's new society. Headmaster Snape had terrified Daniel when he attended Hogwarts, but the Slytherins were afraid of him too. That fear kept the Slytherin students in line. In retrospect, Severus Snape was not as bad as the other Death Eaters. Students did not die while at Hogwarts. The headmaster had done nothing to stop Slytherin harassment, but he had set strict limits to it. "This is a school," he told the students time and time again. "All students here shall learn. Nons may be misguided and thus inferior, but they are still pure-blood wizards, and as such valued by the Dark Lord. You shall not destroy that which he values. Student behavior that prevents learning shall not be tolerated." Headmaster Snape operated on the philosophy that students could not learn while in need of medical attention. Consequently, any harassment that required follow-up treatment at the infirmary was harshly punished. Abusive Slytherins could not hope to hide their actions behind nons too terrified to talk or go to the infirmary. The headmaster watched student attendance and performance closely. His eagle eye always noticed the absent student or the one too traumatized to properly work. Nor did the headmaster bother questioning the nons to find the source of harassment. He asked the Slytherins themselves. Woe to the student who tried to lie to the headmaster. He knew all the tricks. The headmaster could ferret out the tiniest truth between the lies. He had turned many a smug Slytherin into a quivering mass of jelly for daring to deceive him or oppose his rule. Eventually, Layla had learned proper behavior. It was the only way to stop the harassment. Eventually, the Slytherins moved on to other victims. Even out of school, Layla now kept her head down and her eyes averted whenever she saw Daniel in his uniform. It hurt to think his own daughter was afraid of him. Daniel had to repeatedly remind himself it was the uniform she was responding to, not him. At least he hoped it was. There was no way the green-eyed girl could have spent 2 years at Hogwarts and failed to learn how to display proper respect, yet somehow she had. Daniel took some more bites while he pondered different aspects of the girl. Why had she run? What had happened to her parents? Was she related to the Diggorys? What about that book? Daniel could think of only one way she could have known about that book, but no one like that attended Hogwarts. Layla would have told him. Daniel finished his meal with more questions than answers, and no closer to a solution. He sighed as he packed up his things. This was one puzzle not easily solved in a day. He had other work to get done, and it would not happen in the staff room. Daniel left the staff room and walked down the hall to his office. He found Cedric Diggory standing in the doorway of his office. "You have a message for me?" asked Daniel, wondering how long Cedric had stood there waiting for him. Daniel's thoughts returned to the girl who said Cedric had been thirsty. Had she really known? Did Cedric ever get hungry during the day? No one, to Daniel's knowledge, ever fed Cedric while at work. "Wizard Flint wants to see Pilkington immediately," said Cedric calmly. "Who gave you this message?" asked Daniel while he removed his robes and hung them up. Wizard Flint wasn't due back from Azkaban until tomorrow. That left Wizard Higgs in charge. He had long since tired of using Cedric as a tool for spurious messages, but someone else could have put Cedric up to it. "Wizard Flint," answered Cedric without emotion. "Thank you," said Daniel thoughtfully. That was pretty definite. Cedric knew the names of the people with whom he frequently worked. If he didn't know the name, Cedric would helplessly repeat the message again. "Wizard Diggory," Daniel added, "return to your seat and sit down." Cedric turned and walked to his chair. Did Cedric ever tire of standing or sitting? Daniel put away his lunchbox and quickly checked his appearance. He wondered what brought Wizard Flint back so soon. Daniel found Wizard Flint alone in his office, straightening out his uniform. Daniel stood at the door respectfully, waiting to be noticed. "Come in here right now," ordered the wizard when he noticed Daniel's arrival. "Where have you been?" he growled. "I've been looking everywhere for you." "I've been eating lunch," replied Daniel respectfully, giving a quick bow before stepping into the room. "I know that," snarled Wizard Flint, "but where? You weren't at your house. I checked." "I was in the staff room," replied Daniel evenly. Then he added silently, "You checked my house? I hope Terrica and the kids are all right." Unannounced Slytherin visits to the house were always invasive and upsetting. Wizard Flint had never before visited his house, and Daniel had no idea how Flint would behave towards his family. Wizard Flint's face twisted in disgust at Daniel's words. "No one ever goes to the non-staff room," he disagreed. "I do," replied Daniel coolly. "Did you want me for something?" he asked, changing the subject. "Yes," he snarled. Using his wand, Flint caused his office door to close. Then the wizard walked to his desk, picked up a folder, and handed it to Daniel. "I want you to put this out on Muggle Security Alert immediately," he commanded. Daniel opened the folder and saw a grainy photo of the girl with green eyes. His mouth dropped open, and he looked up at Wizard Flint in surprise. "Isn't this the girl that you just—" "Yeah, tell me about it," Wizard Flint snapped. "But you had her secured," Daniel said in confusion. "I saw her. I saw both of you." "I know," admitted Wizard Flint angrily. "What can I say? The little witch got away." "But that's Daniel shut his mouth. He seemed to say that a lot about this girl. "Tell me what happened," he encouraged instead, filling his voice with sympathy and concern. This was one story he did not want to miss. "We had gotten under way," began Wizard Flint, "and I had just begun my sandwich when the girl said she wasn't feeling well. They always say that," added Wizard Flint dismissively while pacing the floor. "So I didn't pay her any mind." "What happened?" asked Daniel, hanging on his every word. "The next thing I knew, she puked all over me." "No," said Daniel, properly aghast. "What did you do?" "What do you think I did? I pulled over to teach her a lesson." "Of course," agreed Daniel sympathetically. He didn't mention that by pulling over and stopping, Wizard Flint had broken numerous security rules. Of course, Daniel would have considered doing the same thing under similar circumstances. Wands didn't work in a security transport, and the prospect of completing a trip to Azkaban while sitting in a compartment full of vomit would be disagreeable indeed. What happened next? "I had just begun explaining the rules when—" Wizard Flint rubbed his arm unconsciously. "When?" prompted Daniel. "When she bit me." "No." "Yes," exploded Wizard Flint angrily. "And not only that, but—" "But what?" encouraged Daniel. "Well, when she bit me, I was so surprised my wand dropped." "Did she get it?" asked Daniel with concern. "No, of course not," retorted Wizard Flint. "Worse." "Worse?" "Yeah, I was bending over to get it when she kicked me." "Kicked you?" echoed Daniel, struggling to keep a straight face. "That's terrible," he exclaimed, while privately wondering where. His imagination went wild with possible locations. "Don't I know it," agreed Wizard Flint. "In the shin, no less." "That must have hurt," sympathized Daniel in a sincere-sounding voice. "It did," Wizard Flint agreed. "And then she stepped on my wand and broke it." "No!" exclaimed Daniel, sounding properly distressed. Broken wands were nearly as bad as lost or stolen wands. They required all sorts of paperwork and investigations to replace. "What did you do?" "Well, she ran, and I went after her." "You caught her, surely." "I should have," agreed Wizard Flint, "but somehow I lost her." "You lost her?" said Daniel in disbelief. "Yeah," replied Wizard Flint disgustedly. "I was right behind her. She rounded the corner, and when I reached the corner, she was gone." "Gone?" "Gone," repeated Wizard Flint angrily. "I searched everywhere, and there was no sign of her. I can't think where she got to so fast," he muttered in frustration. "But we'll find her," he added determinedly. "She can't have gone far. I already notified Wizard Security and called out the Dementors. Do you have any idea who the girl is?" "No, sir, she never said," replied Daniel honestly. The false name she had given didn't count. "That's what I thought. I already have Higgs doing a non-head count. I want to find out who she is immediately. Her parents are going to pay for this, too." That little brat is going to regret having ever crossed me." "She will indeed," agreed Daniel. "What else would you like me to do?" he asked, becoming businesslike, taking out an order form and quill. This order would require notes to make sure he didn't forget anything. It also protected Daniel, should Wizard Flint try to later claim Daniel failed to follow orders properly. "Well," began Wizard Flint, "besides notifying Muggle security, I want you to get her photo and description on all the Muggle crime alert systems. The information you need is all ready for you in the folder," he added, nodding to the folder he had given Daniel earlier. "I want finding her given top priority." "Yes, sir," said Daniel, rapidly writing. "What crime shall I assign the girl?" That was for the benefit of the Muggles. He couldn't tell them they were looking for a fugitive witch. "I don't know," replied Wizard Flint in an annoyed voice. "Say she is wanted for questioning in connection to whatever the latest terrorist attack is on record." "Very well, sir," said Daniel, continuing to write. That would be the missing cruise ship off the coast of Ireland, if Daniel's memory was correct, and it usually was. "Anything else?" "Yes. Hand her photo and description to the Daily Prophet and put her on the Wizard's Person of Interest alert as well. I want to make sure there is no place she can hide." Wizard Flint rubbed his arm again. "When I get my hands on her, she'll wish she'd gone quietly to Azkaban. You don't happen to have anything for bites on that potion shelf of yours, do you?" No," responded Daniel with a straight face. "But I will see to it that I get some immediately for future use," he added. "Prominently labeled and displayed. No, strike that. The bite potion would be placed in the most innocuous, unlabeled bottle Daniel could find. Wizard Flint would never tolerate a visual reminder of this incident, and Daniel wanted to remember and savor the event for years to come. "I do have some potions to reduce pain, if you think that might help," Daniel suggested solicitously. "I'm afraid they're not up to first-class standards in taste, though." "That's okay, I'll manage," replied Wizard Flint, rubbing his arm again. "I don't have time anyway. I'm going to Thorpe." "Thorpe, sir?" "Yes. It seems that our little witch bought 2 tickets to Thorpe, not 1. The bus will be getting in soon, and I want to be there to pick up the other person. Then we can use that person to trap her." "An excellent idea. Will there be anything else?" "I think that about covers it," replied Wizard Flint thoughtfully. "Then I'll get started. You do that." Daniel turned to leave. "One more thing." Daniel froze in place. "Sir?" he questioned. "I've a potions cleanup for you to do." Daniel turned and looked at Wizard Flint. "Sir?" Wizard Flint nodded significantly at a security bag sitting on the floor next to the desk. "And, another one for you in security transport, too. It's parked in the Muggle Street outside Wizard Security, so you'd better take care of it first. The transport, wasn't safe to bring into headquarters in that condition. Do them both as soon as you finish delivering the alerts." "Yes, sir," replied Daniel, keeping his face perfectly neutral. They both knew it wasn't potions that Wizard Flint was talking about. Daniel pulled out a new order form, which he filled out and then handed to Wizard Flint. Wizard Flint looked briefly at the page and signed it quickly. He held it out for Daniel. When Daniel reached out to take the page, Wizard Flint suddenly grabbed Daniel by the collar and pulled him in close. "Don't you breathe a word about this, ever. Do you understand?" he hissed threateningly in Daniel's ear. Daniel's heart raced uncontrollably. It had been a long time since a Slytherin had physically manhandled him, but the instinctive fear learned at Hogwarts was still there. "Of course not," replied Daniel, keeping his voice barely above a whisper so it wouldn't tremble. Daniel slowly used his free hand to reach into his pocket and pulled out a new order form. Wizard Flint looked at it questioningly. "She isn't my case," continued Daniel, sounding calmer than he felt. His quill floated gently out and started writing rapidly on the form. "I have no reason to talk to anyone about any of this," he added, holding out the finished order form to the wizard. "With this, I can't." Wizard Flint stared at Daniel, his cold blue eyes appraising him thoughtfully. Abruptly, he released his grip on Daniel. Daniel staggered a bit, regaining his balance. Then he stood in place, still holding the order. The wizard snatched the paper from Daniel's hand and signed it. "See that you remember that," he told Daniel, handing the form back. Daniel closed his eyes and breathed a short sigh in relief. "Yes, sir," he nodded, taking the signed form and adding it to the others in his folder. Of course, they both knew that were he ordered to do so, Daniel would turn all order forms over to a Death Eater or his designated representative for inspection. at which time Daniel would honestly answer any and all questions put to him. But Wizard Flint would no doubt make sure Daniel's name would never come up concerning today's events, so no one would ever think to question him. That suited Daniel just fine. It meant no one would have the opportunity to ask Daniel about his interview with the girl, never learned that she could be headed to London or had blonde hair. The door swung open abruptly. Both Daniel and Wizard Flint looked up. Wizard Higgs walked inside with 4 other wizards. Daniel looked hastily down and away. Death Eaters. They looked for excuses to cast their curses. Daniel only had a brief glimpse, but he recognized them all. There were 3 Death Eaters and 1 regular wizard. The regular wizard was a very old, thin man with large, pale, silvery eyes. That was Mr. Ollivander, the wand maker. It was from him that Daniel had first gotten his wand so many years ago. The other 3 were Wizards Malfoy, Goyle, and Witch Bulstrode. They were older than Daniel and called themselves the New Death Eaters, part of the select younger generation who had sworn loyalty to the Dark Lord after his ascent to power. Wizard Malfoy was fairly tall, thin, with blonde hair and a pale, pointed face. He had a dislike for all things Muggle. His father, Lucius Malfoy, currently served as the Muggle Prime Minister and proudly looked down upon the very people he supposedly served. Wizard Goyle was almost the same height as Wizard Malfoy, but was much heavier, with thick muscles beneath his robe. Witch Bulstrode was shorter than the other 2 Death Eaters. She was a thin lady with beady black eyes, thin lips, and red-brown hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Sorry to disturb you," said Wizard Hicks, "but I have a non-head count to be done, and he's the last one in the station to be counted," Wizard Higgs added, explaining while he nodded towards Daniel. "That's all right," said Wizard Flint, taking the runner folder from Daniel and moving back to his desk. "We're finished here." Wizard Higgs stepped forward. Wizards Malfoy and Goyle moved into position with wands extended on either side of Daniel. They were precisely 3 arms' length in distance, as was required by the official procedure concerning head counts. They both stood far enough away so Daniel couldn't reach them, yet close enough to use their wands on Daniel, if necessary. Wizard Higgs unrolled an official parchment and read aloud. "By official order of Wizard Security," he began in an imperious tone, "you are hereby commanded to participate in a head and wand count. Failure to comply will result in your immediate imprisonment." That's what the Death Eaters were for. In case Daniel tried to resist or run, they would subdue him, using whatever force was necessary. Wizards Malfoy and Goyle pointed their wands menacingly at Daniel, as if daring him to make a move. Daniel knew better. Both wizards had a reputation for firing curses first and asking questions later. If rumors were true, they already had several kills to their names. "State your name and rank for the record," droned Wizard Higgs. "Lieutenant Daniel Pilkington, Senior Detective, Wizard, 2nd Class," Daniel replied in a wooden tone. Like all Nons, he hated these counts, but he could do nothing about them. "Lieutenant Daniel Pilkington, Senior Detective, Wizard, 2nd Class, is on the register," confirmed Witch Bulstrode in a formal, authoritative voice, reading from her own parchment paper. Her voice was harsh and rough. It grated on Daniel's ear. "Visual identification confirmed," said Wizard Higgs. "I know him personally." "Check," said Witch Bulstrode. "Produce your wand for inspection," Wizard Higgs commanded. Wizards Malfoy and Goyle tensed up. They watched closely as Daniel pulled out his wand. If Daniel planned to resist, this would be the best moment. Everyone in the room visibly relaxed when Daniel merely handed his wand to Wizard Ollivander for inspection. Wizards Malfoy and Goyle both eased their stance. "Another sniveling coward," taunted Wizard Malfoy with a sigh of disgust. Daniel ignored him, keeping his eyes carefully lowered. The real resistors had been weeded out years ago, most killed outright. The Nons who still remained free would not dream of resisting. For them, the price was too high. This made the Death Eater's presence more of a formality. Unfortunately, the lack of resistance created some very bored Death Eaters, looking for any excuse to cast their spells. Wizard Ollivander looked at Daniel's wand carefully. "Oak," he pronounced softly. 12 inches with the heartstrings of dragon." "Oak," replied Witch Bulstrode. 12 inches with the heartstrings of dragon. "That should be Pilkington's wand," she confirmed. Last spell used? She asked. Daniel thought swiftly. What had been the last spell he had used with it? At the very least, a wrong answer guaranteed stiff fines and whatever non-lethal curses the Death Eaters decided to cast. Matters would be much worse if Daniel couldn't get the answer right. That would imply someone else had used the wand. Bulxus capsula, he replied. For lunch, he added, knowing that would be her next question. Of course, it hadn't been his lunch, but that was of no concern of theirs. Hopefully, Wizard Flint would not want Daniel to explain further and would prevent further inquiry about spells. Yeah, agreed Wizard Flint. I saw him use it. Wizard Ollivander placed the tip of his wand against the tip of Daniel's wand and whispered, Prior incantato. The wand sparked briefly, and the folding box erupted from the point where the two wands met. Wizard Ollivander nodded. Bulxus capsula, he confirmed. Last spell used, Bulxus capsula, confirmed, said Witch Bulstrode loudly in her gravelly voice. Are you carrying any other wands? No, replied Daniel. Suddenly he felt his whole body go rigid as Wizard Malfoy cast the wand-seeking spell on him. They never took anyone's word when it came to a head count. The wand-seeking spell lasted but a moment, and then Daniel's limbs went limp again. Daniel swayed a bit before regaining his balance. He's clean, confirmed Wizard Malfoy. Check, replied Wizard Bulstrode firmly. Arms at your side. Open your mouth, she commanded, drawing out a sinister-looking black bottle. Wizards Malfoy and Goyle raised their wands and tensed up again. They would happily cast a spell to tie Daniel up if he didn't comply. Daniel looked with dismay at the size of the spoon which Bulstrode had pulled out. A serving spoon? He thought in despair, wanting to plead for less. Daniel knew that they needed no more than a teaspoon at most, but he kept his words to himself. He'd heard stories how the Death Eaters had gleefully poured the contents of the whole bottle down the throats of protesting nons. Witch Bulstrode uncorked the bottle and poured the black sparkling goo into the spoon, filling it to the brim. Open your mouth, she commanded again harshly, and tip your head back. Her black eyes glittered malevolently, watching him while she waited for Daniel to respond. Daniel swallowed uncomfortably. This was by far the worst part of a non-head count. Daniel hated the potion and the idea of being force-fed the stuff like a baby. Unfortunately, there was no way out of it. They wouldn't let him have the filled spoon to take the potion himself, in case he would somehow transfigure the potion into something less potent. Not that such a thing was even possible. Daniel knew the Death Eaters would force the stuff down his throat, whether he liked it or not. Better to cooperate and retain some shred of dignity than not. Daniel closed his eyes, tipped his head back, and reluctantly opened his mouth. Then he smelled it coming near. Daniel always tried to hold his breath, but somehow it never worked. The stuff smelled nasty, something like a rotting putrefied skunk mixed in with rotting fish and every other thing he had ever smelled that was dead and dying. Instinctively he tried to close his mouth and get away, but someone roughly grabbed his hair and yanked his head back even further, while unseen hands grabbed his jaw and opened his mouth wider. Daniel clenched his fists and made himself not move, not resist. The whole glob of ghastly stuff hit his tongue at once and started to slither down his throat. Tasting indescribably worse than castor oil, Daniel's gag reflex immediately set in. He started choking and trying to spit it up, but the same hand that held his mouth open now forced it closed and held it shut. Daniel's hands instinctively moved up to his throat, but they were suddenly squeezed tight to his sides. That's the way, whispered a voice in his ear. Want to struggle some more? The voice invited. But Daniel was way past caring what the voice said. The first of the potion had made it down his throat, and his whole body seemed consumed with trying to get rid of it. Daniel jerked and convulsed uncontrollably. The hand clutching his jaw held him up, while he struggled helplessly. Suddenly the restriction around his chest vanished, and Daniel's arms flew free. The hand let go of Daniel's jaw, and Daniel dropped to the floor coughing and gagging, but unable to vomit. Daniel placed his hands on the floor to steady himself. No reaction to the potion, came the harsh, clinically disinterested voice. Identity confirmed. Of course there was a reaction to the potion. The stuff was horrible, but that was the usual reaction. not the reaction for which they watched. Daniel had first tasted the black potion when he was attending Hogwarts. Headmaster Snape had called together the whole student population and lined up the nons the second day of exams one year. He instructed the Slytherins to give each non a single teaspoon of the black stuff. Not knowing what to expect, there had been no resistance and no need for restraints. It hadn't smelled as bad then either, as Daniel recalled. Anyway, the physical reaction had been much the same. When Daniel had stopped gagging and convulsing and could again look around, he discovered 4 of his classmates had hideous black boils covering their face, hands, and presumably the rest of their body. The Slytherins snickered delightedly. Headmaster Snape's black eyes narrowed dangerously, and he scowled as he scrutinized the 4, but said not a word. Then he sent the 4 to the infirmary. The rest of the nons were sent to their dorm and placed into lockdown for the rest of the day. The 4 later returned to the dorms with the boils gone, but the skin still covered with huge black patches. Their skin remained blackened for days afterwards from the experience. They said the potion had burned like fire when it went down their throat. The 4 never said a word as to the reason the black-colored potion might have affected them differently, no doubt sworn to secrecy by some Slytherin, but Daniel had a pretty good idea. He knew those 4 had used Polyjuice Potion just the day before to take an exam in place of some particularly stupid Slytherins. Daniel knew this because on various occasions he had seen each of the 4 practice copying handwriting samples. Daniel had been doing the same thing, no doubt for the same reason. A month earlier, Graham Pritchard had cornered Daniel and started making him practice the handwriting of Graham's younger brother, Stuart. Stuart was a year younger than Daniel and particularly horrible at potions. He needed a good exam score to offset all his previous marks. Graham planned to give Daniel some Polyjuice Potion and make Daniel take the exam in place of Stuart. Graham promised dire consequences if Daniel failed to convince the professor of his identity as Stuart and/or failed to pass the exam. The students were released from lockdown the next day, and the Slytherins, though not their usual arrogant selves, said not a word about what had happened in the non's absence. Graham pinned Daniel down after breakfast and made it clear that Daniel would still be taking Stuart's exam on schedule. Graham was of the opinion that as Daniel had already taken the Polyjuice Revealing Potion and passed, there should be no problem with the exam. Graham met Daniel in the bathroom right before Stuart's exam and fed him the Polyjuice Potion. Daniel immediately became violently sick, more than what he had been led to expect from a Polyjuice Potion. Daniel never changed shapes, but instead got progressively sicker and sicker. His hands shook so bad Daniel couldn't hold a quill, let alone write. His stomach cramped up and he began to vomit. When Daniel wasn't vomiting, he was screaming in agony. After that, Daniel didn't remember anything until he woke up in the infirmary 3 days later with a throat so raw and scratchy he could scarcely whisper. Friends later told him more of the story. Headmaster Snape noticed Daniel's absence at lunch and immediately initiated a search. They found Daniel 2 hours later stuffed in a garbage bin at the old groundskeeper's house, curled up in a ball, screaming in pain. No one had heard his cries earlier because someone had placed a muffliato spell around Daniel. Daniel was found still shaking and trying to vomit, though he had long since emptied his stomach. The headmaster had again placed the nons in a lockdown for the rest of the day, and afterwards exams continued on as usual. Daniel took his exams under supervision while still in the infirmary that year. He never learned what score Stuart got on his potions exam, or if he ever took it. Neither Graham nor Stuart ever came near Daniel again. Every year afterwards, the nons were lined up once or twice during the exams and made to take the black potion. The experience was positively revolting every time, and the Slytherins took great enjoyment in holding down the uncooperative nons. But Daniel noticed the Slytherins also stopped using nons in disguise to augment their exam scores. Security officials included the black potion in non-head counts soon afterwards. It ensured no non could use the Polyjuice Potion to be counted twice while trying to cover for a missing non. There were a lot of missing nons in the early years. Daniel had no idea what would happen to someone who swallowed the black potion while actually under a Polyjuice Potion disguise. But it was probably something horrible. As the use of Polyjuice Potion was strictly prohibited for nons, a reaction to the black potion alerted security officials of illegal activities. The potion's lingering effects also prevented nons from using Polyjuice Potion long after a head count. Eventually, the coughing and gagging slowed enough so Daniel could breathe normally again. It didn't actually take too long, but it always seemed like an eternity. Daniel raised his head and looked around. The room was empty. Daniel's wand was on the floor beside him. In theory, someone should have remained to personally return the wand, but Daniel was glad they hadn't. At least they let him recover in privacy. Beneath the wand was a runner's folder, and lying next to it was the security case, a pointed reminder from Wizard Flint that a non-head count was no excuse to ignore his other responsibilities. Daniel slowly rose to his feet. There has got to be another way to determine whether someone was under the effect of Polyjuice Potion, he thought disgustedly, while swallowing frequently, trying to get the foul taste out of his mouth. Swallowing didn't work, though, nor did spitting. Spitting only made his throat hurt more. Daniel knew the taste would linger in his mouth for several days. Even if there were another method to determine Polyjuice use, Daniel doubted the Slytherins would use it. They liked the effect of the black potion too much. It was only given to nons, and was a grim reminder to everyone who was in power. Daniel stood still a few moments, getting his bearings. Then he straightened out his uniform. Next, Daniel bent down and picked up the folder and grabbed the security case. Then he stepped out of the office, closing the door behind him. The black potion always left him feeling weak, so Daniel chose his steps with care. He didn't want to be seen staggering or stumbling while in the hallway. Daniel slowly made his way back to the small table in the alcove. He set down the security case, poured himself a tumbler of water, and drank deeply. The water revived him a bit. It also helped remove the foul taste in his mouth, but not much. Daniel looked over at Cedric Diggory sitting straight and still in his chair. Cedric's hair was tipped up, and he was facing the ceiling. Daniel felt nothing but anger and disgust at the Death Eaters. Surely they could tell Cedric was no security threat. They didn't need to treat him that way. "Wizard Diggory, straighten your head," ordered Daniel gently. Cedric lowered his head and again faced the wall, as he usually did. Some drops of black potion trickled down one side of the corner of his lips. Daniel poured himself another glass of water. Then he pulled out a handkerchief and wiped the black stuff from Cedric's lips. Replacing the handkerchief, Daniel took another long drink and looked at Cedric thoughtfully. Did the black potion smell and taste bother Cedric? Did he convulse like everyone else? On impulse, Daniel picked up another tumbler and poured out some more water. He handed the glass to Cedric. "Wizard Diggory," said Daniel, "drink the water in the glass." Cedric drank the water, emptying the tumbler. Daniel gently removed the glass from Cedric's hand and replaced it on the table. Then he picked up the security case and continued on his way to his office. Daniel reached his office without incident. As always, he checked his security sensor before entering. Daniel froze. Someone had been in his office during his absence. Daniel looked up and into the hazel eyes of a stranger with sandy-colored hair sitting behind his desk.